I was in my garage when it happened. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and I had grease on my hands from working on my daughter's car. She'd mentioned the brakes were grinding a few weeks back, and I'd told her to bring it over on her day off. That was the kind of thing I liked doing, not because I had nothing else to occupy my time, but because it was the only language I knew for saying I love you without making anyone uncomfortable. I was 64 years old, recently retired from 31 years in residential construction, and this was how I'd always shown up for the people I cared about. With my hands, with my time, with whatever I had. My phone was sitting on the workbench, face up, next to a half-empty cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago. It buzzed. I wiped my palms on a shop rag and picked it up. The message was from my son-in-law. I read it once. Then I set the phone down and looked at it like it might change if I gave it a moment. It didn't. I picked it up and read it again. Hey, just wanted to give you a heads up before the holidays. My mom has been talking about wanting Christmas this year to be just immediate family her side, me, my wife, and the kids. She's getting older and it really means a lot to her. We appreciate everything you've done for us, and we hope you understand. We'll make sure you get time with the kids before or after. I stood there in my garage in Austin, Texas, holding my phone, with the smell of brake dust and motor oil around me, and I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something closer to the feeling you get when you realize you've been reading a map upside down for years, and everything you thought you knew about the road ahead was wrong. My daughter had married her husband 6 years ago. He was a good man, mostly. Steady job, took care of my grandchildren, never raised his voice. I had no real complaints about him as a person. But his mother, was a different matter entirely. She was the kind of woman who moved through a room like she owned the air in it. She had opinions about everything, delivered with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. And she had spent the last 6 years making it quietly, politely, systematically clear that she considered herself the primary grandmother in my grandchildren's lives. She lived 12 minutes away from my daughter's house. I lived 45 minutes out, closer to the lake, in the house I'd built myself on 5 acres, back when my wife was still alive. My wife passed 8 years ago, breast cancer. We had 30 years together, and I would have given every one of them twice over if it meant more time with her. After she was gone, my daughter and my grandchildren became the gravity that held my world in orbit. I wasn't the kind of man who talked about that. I just showed up. I'd shown up in a lot of ways. 3 years ago, when my daughter and her husband were struggling to pull together a down payment on a house in a neighborhood with good schools, I'd quietly transferred $68,000 into their account. I didn't make a speech about it. I didn't ask for anything back. I told my daughter it was an early inheritance, that her mother would have wanted her to have it, and I meant every word. I also spent 4 weekends that summer renovating their kitchen. New cabinets I built myself, countertops I installed, tile backsplash I laid by hand. My son-in-law helped where he could, and I appreciated that. It was good time between us. My daughter cried when she saw it finished. That made it worth it. When my grandson needed surgery for his appendix 2 years ago, the night call that came at 2 in the morning, I drove 45 minutes in the dark and sat in that waiting room until sunrise. My son-in-law's mother sent flowers the next day. I wasn't keeping score. I want to be clear about that. I was not the kind of man who kept score. I did those things because they were my family, and that's what you did for family. I didn't expect a monument. I didn't need applause. I just expected, not even expected, I just assumed, I suppose, that I was part of the family, that my presence at Christmas wasn't something that needed to be approved by a committee. I set my phone face down on the workbench, and I finished the brakes. I needed something to do with my hands. That night I sat on my back porch and looked out at the lake and thought about what kind of man I wanted to be about this. There was a version of me that called my daughter immediately, said something sharp and direct that I would probably regret. There was another version that called my son-in-law and told him exactly what I thought of a message like that being delivered by text. Both of those versions felt satisfying for about 3 seconds when I imagined them, and then they felt like watching a fire spread to something you didn't intend to burn. I thought about my grandchildren. My granddaughter was 7. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness, and she called me Grandpa D like it was one word. Grandpad, running together the way children do when they love something and they're in a hurry to get to it. My grandson was 10. He was at the age where he was starting to act like hugs were optional. But if I showed up with a Project Birdhouse, model airplane, anything that required tools, he'd work beside me for 3 hours without looking up. They were the reason I kept my voice low that night when I finally called my daughter. She picked up on the second ring, and I could tell from the way she said hello that she already knew why I was calling. "Did your husband talk to you before he sent me that message?" I asked. A pause. "Yes. And you were okay with it?" Another pause, longer this time. "Dad, it's complicated. She's been really emotional lately about getting everyone together." She made it sound like, "I just want to understand something," I said. "Are you telling me that I'm not welcome at Christmas? At your house?" "It's not that you're not welcome, because I'd like you to say it plainly if that's what we're doing." I heard her exhale. She wants it to be her side this year. Just this once. She's talking about maybe alternating years going forward. "She's talking about it," I said. "What are you talking about?" She didn't answer that right away. I told her I loved her. I told her I wasn't angry at her. I told her I needed a day to think, and I'd call her back. Then I hung up and sat with the dark and the water and the sound of something that felt like the last of something ending. Here's what I want you to understand about the weeks that followed. I am not a man who sulks. I am not a man who waits for other people to fix things. I spent 31 years building houses from the ground up, and I can tell you that there is no problem so complicated that it can't be approached with patience and a clear head and an honest assessment of what you're actually working with. What I was working with was this. My son-in-law's mother had decided over the past 6 years that she was the center of my grandchildren's family, that her preferences took precedence, that my daughter's father, the man who built those children's swing set, who sat in the surgical waiting room at 2 in the morning, who handed over $68,000 without a single string attached, was an optional participant in the holidays that his own grandchildren would remember for the rest of their lives. And my daughter, whom I raised to be braver than this, had let it happen. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about what my wife would have said. She was the kind of woman who could identify the real problem in any situation inside of 30 seconds and name it out loud without making you feel stupid for having missed it. She would have looked at me across the kitchen table and said, "The problem isn't the woman. The problem is that your daughter hasn't decided yet who she is." She was right about most things. I did not call my son-in-law back that week. I did not send a long text. I did not show up at their house unannounced. I went about my life. I drove to the hardware store. I had coffee with a friend from the old crew. I watched the news and felt vaguely depressed about the state of things. And I started making a plan. Not a revenge plan. I want to say that clearly. What I had in mind wasn't about punishing anyone. It was about understanding, maybe for the first time in 6 years, where I actually stood. And once I understood that, deciding what to do about it. The first thing I did was make a phone call to my financial advisor. I had set up a college fund for both grandchildren 5 years ago. Automatic contributions every month. Substantial amount. I didn't cancel it. I wasn't going to punish the kids for the behavior of the adults, but I put new paperwork in place. The accounts were already in the children's names. I made sure no one else would ever have access to them or visibility into them except me and, eventually, the kids themselves. Whatever happened between me and the adults in that house, my grandchildren would have their education taken care of, and it would come from their grandfather who loved them. Full stop. No asterisk. The second thing I did was stop. I stopped offering help. Not with anger, not with a speech, just quietly. When my daughter texted about a leak under the bathroom sink, I said I was tied up, but I could refer her to a plumber I trusted. When my son-in-law mentioned his truck was making a noise, I told him it sounded like it might be a belt and gave him the name of a good shop. These were things I would have previously driven 45 minutes to handle myself. Now I was polite and helpful, and completely unavailable in the way I had previously been. I wanted to see how long it took for anyone to notice. About 3 weeks in, my daughter called and asked if something was wrong. "Nothing's wrong," I said. "How are the kids?" "They're good, Dad. You seem different." "I'm the same," I said. "How's the house?" There was a silence on the line that felt different from the silences we usually had, more uncertain, like she was trying to read a room that had been rearranged while she wasn't looking. "Are you upset about Christmas?" she asked. "I had a feeling about Christmas," I said. "I've made other plans. I don't want you to worry about it." "What other plans?" "I'm thinking about going to see your Uncle Roy in Nashville. He's been asking for a couple of years. Seems like a good year to do it." Another silence. "Dad, I love you," I said. "Call me when you can." My son-in-law's mother found out I was no longer coming to Christmas about 2 weeks before the holiday. I don't know exactly what she felt about that, because I never spoke to the woman directly about any of this. But I know that she called my daughter, and I know that after that call, my daughter called me. And I know that the conversation we had that night was the longest and most honest one we'd had in 6 years. My daughter started by telling me that her mother-in-law felt bad. "I'm sure she does," I said. "She didn't mean for it to come across the way it did." "How did she mean for it to come across?" "She just wanted her family together for the holidays. She wasn't trying to exclude you." "She asked her son to send me a text message," I said, informing me that I was not invited to Christmas at my own daughter's house. In November, after 6 years of showing up for this family in every way, I knew how. I'd like to know how that was meant to come across, if not as an exclusion. My daughter was quiet. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," I said. "I'm saying it because I think we need to be honest with each other. You're my daughter. You're the most important person in my life after your mother. And I have felt, for a while now, that I come second in your household. Not second to your husband, which would be right and natural. Second to his mother. And I've been patient about it because I know family dynamics are complicated. And I love you. And I didn't want to make your life harder than it needs to be." "Dad, that's not—" "Let me finish." She let me finish. "I'm not going to fight with that woman," I said. "I'm not going to call her and have it out. That's not who I am. But I need you to hear me say this. I have bent over backwards to be present in your life and your children's lives since your mother died. And I have asked for nothing in return except to be treated like I matter. Like I'm part of this family. And when your husband sent me that message, I understood something that I think I'd been avoiding understanding for a while." "What?" she asked, and her voice was smaller now. "That I need to stop making it so easy for people to take me for granted," she cried. I let her. I didn't tell her to stop, and I didn't tell her everything was fine, because those would have both been lies, and she deserved better than that. When she was able to talk again, she said, "I should have called you myself. I should have never let him send that message." "No," I agreed. "You shouldn't have." "I'm sorry, Dad." "I know you are." We talked for another hour after that. Real talking. The kind we hadn't done in a while. She told me about the pressure she felt from her mother-in-law, how the woman had a gift for framing her own preferences as needs, how my daughter had learned to accommodate her because the alternative was an atmosphere in the house that was unbearable for days. I listened without interrupting, which was hard for me, because what I wanted to say was, "That is your husband's problem to solve. That is not something you should be managing alone." But I let her talk until she was done. "What do I do?" she asked at the end. "That's up to you," I said, "and it's up to your husband. I'm not going to tell you how to run your marriage. But I can tell you what I need, which is to feel like I have a place in my grandchildren's lives." "You have that," she said immediately. "I'm glad you feel that way," I said. "I hope your husband's mother eventually does too." Christmas came and went. I drove to Nashville and spent 4 days with my brother and his wife and their kids and grandkids, and I ate too much and stayed up too late playing cards, and I laughed more than I had in months. It was a good Christmas. Not the Christmas I would have chosen, but a good one. My grandchildren called me Christmas morning. My granddaughter cried because I wasn't there. My grandson, who had reached the age of performed indifference, said in a voice that was trying too hard to be casual, "Grandpad, we missed you." I had to excuse myself from the card table for about 3 minutes after that call. The conversation with my son-in-law happened in January. He called me. That surprised me. I had been expecting my daughter to broker everything, the way she usually did, smoothing the edges before anyone had to be uncomfortable. But he called me himself on a Saturday morning, and he asked if he could come out to the house. I said yes. He drove out alone. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table that I'd eaten at for 30 years, and he was quiet for a moment in the way men are when they've rehearsed something and are deciding whether to use what they prepared or say the real thing instead. He said the real thing. I handled that badly, he said. The message, the whole thing. I should have called you. I should have talked to you first, man to man. What I did was cowardly, and I've felt bad about it ever since. I looked at him across the table. I appreciate that, I said. My mother, he started, then stopped. Started again. I love my mother. But she has a way of making her preferences feel like emergencies, and I've spent my whole life responding to her emergencies. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about whether what she was asking for was actually reasonable. Is that something you've figured out recently? I asked. Or something you've known for a while? He gave me a look that was half rueful, half embarrassed. Somewhere in the middle, he said. My wife helped me see some things more clearly over the last few weeks. Your wife is a smart woman, I said. She gets that from her father, he said. I took a drink of my coffee and decided to accept that as the peace offering it was intended to be. We talked for almost 2 hours. I'm not going to pretend that everything I'd been carrying for 6 years dissolved over one pot of coffee. It didn't. Trust is rebuilt slowly or not at all. But something real was said that morning by both of us, and I believed him when he said he wanted things to be different. I told him what I needed. Simple things. That I would be at Easter. That I would be at the grandchildren's birthdays. That when I offered help, he could take it or decline it, but the offer would be met with the same respect he'd expect from any man who'd done what I'd done for this family. He nodded to all of it. Not like a man agreeing to terms, but like a man who knew he'd fallen short and was deciding to do better. What about your mother? I asked at the end. He was quiet for a moment. That's mine to handle, he said. That's what I should have been doing all along. I nodded. That was the right answer. I didn't need an apology from that woman or a confrontation or a scene. I needed my son-in-law to understand that his wife was not responsible for managing his mother's emotions, and that his father-in-law was not an optional guest in his own family's life. If he understood those two things and acted on them, the rest would work itself out. I believed he understood them. I still believe that now. Easter was the first holiday we all spent together, after everything that happened. My son-in-law's mother was there. I want to be honest about that. She was there, and so was I. And we were cordial to each other in the way that people are cordial when they have chosen, for the sake of the people they love, not to fight a war they could both probably win at a cost that wasn't worth paying. She did not say anything about Christmas. I did not say anything about Christmas. We passed the green beans, and we both admired my granddaughter's Easter dress, and we coexisted in the same kitchen, and that was enough. My granddaughter held my hand through grace. My grandson showed me a model rocket he'd started building and wanted my opinion on the fins. I told him they'd need to be reinforced if he was planning to launch it, and he pulled out a notebook and asked me to show him how. We sat at the kitchen table together for an hour after dinner, just the two of us, drawing diagrams in his notebook while the adults talked and the TV played in the background. His mother came in once and stood in the doorway watching us, and when I looked up, she was smiling in a way that reminded me, for just a second, of her mother, the way my wife used to stand in a doorway. Later, while we were cleaning up, my daughter came up beside me at the sink. "Is this okay?" she asked quietly. "Being here? More than okay," I said. "I meant what I said in December," she said. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it to your face." I handed her a dish to dry. "You're here now," I said. "That's what counts." She was quiet for a moment, drying the dish with more care than it strictly required. "She's not going to be easy," she said. "His mother. She's not going to suddenly become easy. I know that. But he's different," she said. "He's handling things differently now. You'd notice it if you were around more." "I plan to be around more," I said. She bumped her shoulder against mine the way she used to do when she was a kid, when she wanted to say something and didn't have the words yet. I bumped back. In May, I started picking up my grandchildren from school on Fridays. It started because my daughter had a work commitment that conflicted with pickup for 3 weeks, and she asked if I could help. I said yes. I drove 45 minutes each way, 3 Fridays in a row, And at the end of those 3 weeks, my grandson asked if I was going to keep coming. I told him I'd like to, if it was all right with everyone. He said, with the elaborate casualness of a 10-year-old who has decided something is important to him, I mean, it's fine. We don't care. He got in the truck every single Friday for the next 3 months with the energy of a kid who definitely cared. We drove out to the lake some afternoons. We built things in my garage. I taught my granddaughter to identify tree species by their bark, which she found genuinely fascinating in a way that delighted me. I taught my grandson how to read a level and why it mattered when you were setting a foundation, which I told him was a metaphor for other things. And he said, "Grandpa D, you're doing that thing where you make everything a lesson." And I said, "That's because everything is a lesson." And he rolled his eyes, but he kept listening. My son-in-law's mother came to pick up once in August because my daughter was running late and there had been a mix-up about who was going where. She and I stood in the school parking lot for 11 minutes waiting for the children. We talked about the weather. We talked about how fast the kids were growing. She mentioned that my granddaughter had started taking piano, and I said I hadn't heard that, and something flickered across her face that I recognized the small, involuntary satisfaction of knowing something that someone else doesn't. I let it go. I was learning, at 64, that not every hill was worth dying on, that the measure of a man wasn't how many fights he won, but how many fights he chose not to have without losing himself in the process. I didn't need to be the most important grandparent in those children's lives. I didn't need to win that. I just needed to be present, real, the kind of grandfather they'd drive to see when they were grown, not because they felt obligated, but because there was always something worth finding at the end of that drive. The following Christmas was different. My daughter called me in October early, before any of the holiday machinery had started up, and said, "Dad, I want you here for Christmas, not as a compromise, not alternating years, not as an accommodation. I want my children to grow up with their grandfather at Christmas." And my husband agrees. I didn't say anything for a moment. "I wanted to ask you early," she said, "so you could plan around it. So you'd know. I'll be there," I said. "Good," she said. And then, in a voice that was trying not to sound like it was carrying more weight than it wanted to, "The kids have been asking. They've been asking since last January, actually. My son wanted to know if Grandpa D could teach him to do the thing with the turkey brine this year." I laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere low in the chest. "Tell him absolutely," I said. "Tell him we'll do a whole production." That Christmas, I stood in my daughter's kitchen with my grandson beside me, both of us in aprons I'd bought at the hardware store, because they were the kind with the loops that don't fall off your neck, and I walked him through the brine recipe that my wife had used for 20 years, that her mother had used before that. He stirred and he tasted, and he made a face at the amount of salt involved, and I told him to trust the process, that the salt would do something to the proteins that would change everything in the end. He wrote the recipe in his notebook. My granddaughter had made a centerpiece out of pine cones and ribbon that she presented like a CEO presenting quarterly earnings. Very serious, very proud. My son-in-law's mother sat at the table and said it was beautiful, and I think she meant it. I sat across from my son-in-law at dinner, and we talked about the truck he'd finally gotten fixed, about a project he was considering at the house, about whether my grandson had the patience for fly fishing, because he seemed like he might. We talked like two men who'd decided to be family, which is different from being family by accident. It takes more intention. It's worth more when it holds. After dinner, when the kids had been corralled toward bed and the adults were sitting around with coffee, my granddaughter came back downstairs in her pajamas, ostensibly for a glass of water, and ended up in my lap in the armchair by the window. She fell asleep there, her head against my shoulder, her hair smelling like the apple shampoo she'd used since she was 2 years old. Nobody moved her. Nobody suggested I put her to bed. We all just talked quietly around her, and I sat still, one hand on her back to keep her from sliding, watching the Christmas lights on the tree reflect off the window glass, watching my daughter laugh at something her husband said, watching my grandson through the stairway railing pretend to be asleep so he could listen to the grown-ups a little longer. This was the thing I had almost given up. Not Christmas, not the holidays specifically. This, the ordinary weight of a sleeping child, the sound of a family existing in the same room without effort, the feeling of belonging somewhere that no one had to invite you to because you were already part of the walls. I thought about the message on my phone in the garage, the one that had started all of this. I thought about the man I'd been in that moment, standing in the smell of brake dust, reading words that had made him feel optional. I thought about all the ways I could have handled it that would have ended with me sitting somewhere else that night, alone, right about that matter, but alone. I was glad I hadn't done any of those things. I was glad I had been patient. I was glad I had been honest without being cruel. I was glad I had held my ground in the quiet way, the way that doesn't announce itself, the way that asks people to choose rather than forcing their hands. Some people, when given the chance to choose better than you expected. My daughter had. My son-in-law had, more slowly, but he had. You can't make people love you correctly. You can't force them to see your value, but you can stop making it easy for them to overlook it. And sometimes, when you do that, they look up and they see something they realize they almost lost, and they hold it more carefully from then on. That's not a guarantee. I know that. I've been around long enough to know that not all stories end the way this one did, and that the difference between a story like mine and a harder one is sometimes nothing more than whether the right person makes the right choice at the right moment. My daughter made that choice. I'm not going to take credit for it, but I like to think I gave her the space to make it by not making the alternative too comfortable. My granddaughter shifted in her sleep, made a small sound, settled back against me. I looked out the window at the dark yard, at the Christmas lights of the neighbor's house across the way, at the winter stars visible between the clouds. 64 years old, retired contractor, widower, father, grandfather, present. That was the thing. In the end, that was the thing I had refused to give up. Not the holiday, not the seat at the table, not even the respect, though all of those things mattered. What I had refused to give up was being present, findable, the man who showed up. And you can't take that from a person. You can inconvenience it. You can discourage it. You can send a text message in November that tries to make it feel unnecessary. But if the person it belongs to decides it matters, decides they matter, there is nothing in the world that can actually take it. I held my granddaughter a little closer. Outside, the Christmas lights of the neighborhood burned steady and bright against the dark.